Hey everyone, Michael Unger here from the H.R. McMillan Space Center, joining you on a very special day. Today is the Autumnal Equinox. And so we're going to be doing a really special program today. We've amassed some really cool people that are going to talk to you about our planet. But before we get to them, Rachel is here, of course, to give us the cosmological perspective. Rachel, what is the equinox?
Sure thing. So I have a very brief overview of what the September equinox is. Whoops. So we know that seasons occur on the opposite side, on either side of the equator. And so for the September equinox, it's also known as the fall equinox because in the northern hemisphere, it marks the first day of fall. So we also know that the Earth has some sort of tilt, and that's around 23.5 degrees with respect to what we call the ecliptic plane. And that's just the plane that the Earth orbits around the sun in. And so this tilt is a thing that gives us seasons. So as the Earth travels around in its yearly orbit, one hemisphere is going to be tilted a little bit more towards the sun than the other. And that extra tilt gives us summer, and the other opposite hemisphere gives us winter as it's tilted away. And on any other day of the year, Earth's axis does tilt towards or away from the sun, but the equinoxes mark the moments twice a year when the Earth's axis is not tilted towards or away, and the axial tilt of that 23.5 degrees remains the same. So it is kind of a special day twice a year. So we do have two equinoxes every year. We have one in September and one in March. And the date of when the equinox happens actually varies. And that's because of the difference between the Gregorian calendar year, which is 365 days, and the actual time it takes for the Earth to go around the sun, which is actually 365.25 days. So we have that extra quarter every single year, and that tends to add up, and then that shifts the equinox day every year. But for us this year, the equinox lands on September 22nd. And yeah, that is the first day of fall. So that's a really brief introduction to what the equinox is.
And normally we maybe get more in depth with that, Rachel, but we're going to shift the focus here. And I'm really excited to sometimes branch off into other subjects. So, Rachel, I thought it's the autumnal equinox. It's change. We're coming back to school. And of course, there's a lot of change happening, but there's also a lot of change happening to our planet. And I think most visually, we can see that change happening in trees. And of course, here in Vancouver and of course in British Columbia, we've got lots of trees and we have lots of people that study trees. So I've reached out to a bunch of really cool people that are going to talk to us about their work around trees, and each have a very different perspective. So everyone out there on YouTube land, if you have questions about trees, we've got lots of experts here. Of course, if you have any questions about equinox, make sure to put those into the comments on the chat. And of course, we already got lots of people watching. Maybe put into the comments where you're watching from. We've got Joy, who's watching from Delta, her and her son, Sean. Thanks, Joy and Sean, for joining up. So make sure to put some questions for our guests in their comments, and also like and subscribe because we've got more events coming up. So let's go to our first tree expert, Koskas Dan, who's a Lil'wat Nation elder and a traditional knowledge teacher who's learned from the old people. Hi, Koskas. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. So tell us about trees, and I'm sure that up there where you're from, there are lots of trees surrounding you. So maybe tell us a little bit about why you think trees are so special.
Well, I'll tell you what the old people taught me when I was a kid. It said, imagine you take one nice sized tree and figure out how much water it holds, because we have to dry them all the time. And now let's say you got a forest full of all these trees and all the water that they hold. If there's no trees, can you imagine the water level in the lands? And all these trees, what we breathe out, they breathe in. And what they breathe out, it goes across each other. They take in carbon dioxide, and expel oxygen. We take in oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. So with that, we live together. And so this is what the old people have talked to me about. And then they said, and imagine, if we didn't have any trees, where would we be? We wouldn't have canoes. We wouldn't have houses. Fires would be scarce. Oxygen would be scarce, but there'd be plenty of water. And so eventually said, if there was no trees, there would be no ships we'll be still by ourselves. But because we have trees, the world has mingled, and and so this is. But at the same time, they also said, imagine what it provides us with, and provides everybody else with shelter, and everything that grows under it, even the mycelium grows underneath it. And so the roots, they talk with each other. They got their own language that we cannot understand. But like the old people said, 100 yards away, if one tree died, all the trees around them know about it. And one tree that decides, okay, I'll fill that spot. So they'll fill that spot. And every time one tree dies, another tree would come and fill that, so that there's always the same amount of trees. But those things are going really fast because of the forest fires these years. So trees are very important to us. We're kind of like one with them. But
yeah, no, it's a really important perspective. You know, it's almost, you know, trees are life, and when we talk about life on this planet, they're just as integral to our ecosystem as humans are. Even perhaps humans maybe wouldn't have evolved without trees. That's exactly what you're saying. You know, that we were able to be all connected. That's really fascinating. And with you, besides you, is Tonya Smith, who's a PhD student in the UBC Faculty of Forestry, and you work with Kostas, so in the Lil'wat Nation up there, on food security and traditional medicine use. So why don't you tell us about your work, Tonya?
Yes, so actually I'm going to share a few pictures with everyone now.
Wonderful.
So we have some beautiful trees that I am very fond of that I think that everyone should have a chance to see. So I'll just pull up some pictures. So there's a picture of Koskas, and behind him is I think it's a ponderosa pine. So one of the things that I've been learning about is how like coming from a forestry background, I really understood that trees are really important for making houses, and they're really important for making materials we use every day, like paper. So for example, if we didn't have trees, we'd never have any paper. And if you think of all the things that paper has brought us, you really see one of the major contributions. But also what I've been learning about is how trees are so much more than just what happens to them when we cut them down. So when trees are standing, I wanted to share the story of a tree that's just outside my cabin, actually. So I've been watching this tree. I've been in my house now for a couple of years, and I'm watching this tree change throughout the seasons. And what's really struck me is how much life this one tree brings to this little area outside my cabin. So who comes and visits it? We have squirrels coming and visiting it. The hummingbirds come in the spring and drink from it. There's bats that live in it. The owls come and visit it. There's all sorts of insects. There's beetles and spiders and insects that I don't even know the names of, and they all rely on this tree for their habitat. We have deer that come by and they nibble on the boughs of the plants that grow under the tree. But also surrounding the tree are all of these plants that are really dependent on what the tree provides them to be able to grow there. So there's all these plants in the understory, and there's plants that they're really important for supporting the life of animals, but they can also offer a lot for humans. So there's things like nut trees, and there's green leaves that are edible, and there's berries. And so there's sort of this whole ecosystem going on around each individual tree. And then when you think about how the forest is made of so many trees, then all of a sudden you can really start to understand the diversity that goes on in forests. And I think what's really special about the forest here in Lil'wat is so many of them are old forests, and there's trees that are over thousands of years old. And these trees are holding things that scientists have never seen before, that Koskash's elders may know stories about and know knowledge about. But for people coming from elsewhere, there's things that we can't even begin to understand. So there's this richness in forests there's richness in every ecosystem, but in forests, that richness goes vertical too. So there's things happening in the tops of the canopies, and animals that live their whole lives up there and will never come down to the ground too. So forests just bring an amazing complexity and diversity, I think, that really is unique.
Mm. Yeah, that's really
Yes.
wonderful, Tanya. You know, like what we study here at the Space Center, quite often what we talk about is, you know, like I said, this search for extraterrestrial life. And quite often we don't really fully understand all of the life that is in our planet. And when you talk about these different worlds, forests are almost like an encapsulation of all these different worlds and all this variety, and I find that extremely fascinating and something that I don't know a lot about, and I'm really excited, you know, hearing from you folks. I should certainly hang out with you folks a bit more and nerd out. Got one really cool comment already from Pride, who already made the connection about from canoes to rockets, and sort of like, and how, you know, canoes really connected the world. In the future, you know, eventually rockets will, and sort of like trees were sort of like where that all started. That's really neat, Tanya. So let's go and hear from another perspective. Jordan Gabriel is the field supervisor for the Lil'wat Forestry Ventures, along with many other roles he plays in his community. He's a deep knowledge of the forest and is guiding the pine mushroom research project with the UBC. Hey, Jordan.
Hello.
So tell us all about the pine mushroom research project and some of the work that you do out there.
So we're doing a pine mushroom research because it's back before they put a value to it, it was really highly used for food for our people, right? So they went out to gather it, and then now because of the trees, they made these boats and planes and everything, right? Our mushrooms get shipped all over the world, right? People come from everywhere to pick these mushrooms. So we're trying to protect these areas and make sure that they last forever. But so they always grow under the old growth, Douglas fir, cedar, hemlock stands right up in the mountain. So we've done the study with Emily for 2 years now, and what we did is we went out and collected all the information. We collected all the data and we put it into, because we got our territory pretty well all mapped with LiDAR. So we took the same timber type, put it out there, and asked for 30 of the same timber type, and we went out to walk it and check to see if there's mushrooms growing in it. And actually worked out pretty well. There wasn't a big abundance of it, but there was a few mushrooms found in there. So now we're going to try and introduce it into our forestry program. And before that, I worked with Tonya. We did the herb study, and we collected all natural plants that we use for teas and medicines, and we introduced that into it. So we're trying to make it all come together and not just take the forest for the trees, but for everything that grows underneath it too, right? So back before contact, right? All of our nations used fire in the ecosystem so that they could keep these plants growing for the wildlife and for our communities to live off, and for food and medicines, and then to keep the forest fires down. As you look at what's happening all over the states right now, right? You take fire away from the ecosystem, and then look what happens. People start losing their homes, and we have to start looking into doing more harvesting, right? And when it comes to the old growth, we need to protect some of the old growth, but not all old growths are the same, right? You take the big Douglas fir on the island, it's way different than the big mountain hemlock that's in Whistler, for example, right? So every ecosystem is different. So we got to start looking at it and treating every site different, right? And forest is really important to our nation. We've never benefited from it before, but now we're starting to really take control of it and trying to look after it the way we want to look after it, right? Where to be better for both worlds, right? Make everybody live together and keep down on the forest fires and keep all of the natural berries and mushrooms growing, not just take the trees, for example, which is a good thing, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important what you said there, Jordan, is that there's more to trees than I think just like the barks and like the branches. You're talking about like the undergrowth, and you're talking about obviously the mushrooms that are also connected. And then on a much larger level, like we're also connected because we're now being affected by these forest fires, and the forest fires, a result of largely human activity. And so we do have a big impact on them, just as they have an impact on us. And Jordan, you were talking about your work with Emily. So let's bring Emily into this conversation. Emily Doyle-Yamaguchi is a UBC student in the Faculty of Forestry, working with the Lil'wat Nation to research what makes pine mushroom growth in the forest of their traditional territory, why pine mushrooms are important, and how we can predict their habitat. Hi, Emily. How are you?
Hi, everyone. Good. Thanks so much. First of all, I want to acknowledge that all three who spoke before me, Tonya, Koskas, and Jordan, are all my teachers in this. So I better not, I better do a good job today because they're watching and listening. So as I get started here, I'm just going to share a couple photos of my own from our project. Yeah, I think what we're hearing today is just how important trees and forests, not just trees, but everything that they support and that they're part of in a forest ecosystem, how important they are to our lives. What I want to talk about a little bit today is some of those examples. What's amazing is that it's not just when they're alive, but also even after trees die. They provide a lot of really important services, and they play a really important role in the habitats where they exist. So as far as when they're alive, one of the things that trees do is they, of course, provide food and shelter for a lot of different species. And the species that I'm going to talk about is pine mushroom. So there's a picture of a pine mushroom here, and you can see the habitat that it's growing in. So how this works is basically this mushroom feeds off the sugars that are produced by the tree during photosynthesis. So it feeds off the roots and really can only survive as long as its tree host is alive. So it's a white mushroom, as you can see, and unfortunately we can't transmit smell yet through YouTube. Maybe that's coming, but I'll tell you that they smell a lot like cinnamon, and they appear in the fall. So it's actually kind of cool that we're talking about this right now, because it's pine mushroom season that's getting started. Often they grow in this circle formation around somewhere close to their host. And in Japanese, in fact, this fairy ring, this pine mushroom fairy ring, is called a shiro, which both means white as well as castle. So you can imagine that forests where pine mushrooms grow are full of these like white castles all over the place, hiding under the ground. So there's a few different regions where they grow. Lil'wat territory is just one of those. And I'm working with the nation, as Jordan mentioned earlier, to do this pine mushroom habitat mapping. I also want to acknowledge that pine mushrooms, Jordan was talking about how pine mushroom harvesting is a very lucrative business. And, you know, there's lots of people who travel to do mushroom picking as their job. Lil'wat people have harvested and taken care of pine mushroom areas for millennia. So it really is part of their culture and their way of life to do so. I've had the great pleasure too of learning from Jordan and Koskas and other Lil'wat elders that there's this really strong relationship between the mushrooms and other species. And one in particular is deer. So I'll show you this next photo. Here's a picture on the left of pine mushrooms growing underneath the tree. But then on the right, what you see here is that there's been someone nibbling at this, and that's from a deer. So both the deer and the mushrooms benefit because, you know, the deer get a source of food, and the mushrooms, in the process of the deer eating the mushrooms, it helps the spores to be spread across the landscape. So there's this really cool interdependent relationship there. And I'll just close by saying, you know, forests and trees, they're important to us, they're important to other species. One more example with deer is that, you know, neither the pine mushroom nor deer would be able to survive without a healthy forest. Especially you think about, you know, as it gets colder with the equinox and winter is coming, old forests in particular, they intercept the snow. And that's helpful because, you know, when there's less snow on the ground, it's a lot easier for the deer to walk. It's not as hard. They don't have to spend as much energy, which is really in short supply in that time of year. And the plants that they rely on too don't get buried as much. So yeah, it's really important for us to start to see how there's this really complex web of relationships that are happening all the time when it comes to forests.
Well, it's really wonderful. Thank you, Emily. And just as you were talking, describing sort of with this interconnectedness and sort of and how these forests, these trees have been on this planet for such a long time, and I almost wonder, and I don't know if anyone has an answer to this question, like, are trees like some of the oldest living things on this planet? And how old just are we talking about? And I don't, Rachel, if you if you have any perspective on this as well, just when we're talking about life on Earth. And if we talked about when life really started, are trees right there at the beginning of it? Does anyone want to jump in?
I'll answer that. Well, the trees have to be the oldest ones. When you take a single organism and start to train it to be a plant, it takes millions of years from one organism to form an actual reason why a plant should start from that. So when that organism decided it was going to be a plant, it has to evolve and evolve and evolve and possibly de-evolve again to make what it had to suit its circumstances in the area that's growing in. So now that we got trees, they're going close to each other, that makes them nice and tall. But if they were far apart, they'd stay short. And something like that, yeah.
So in reality, then the trees are the real inhabitants of the Earth, and we're the aliens. Is that kind of what you're saying there, Kostas?
No, the trees are actually the reason why the Earth was allowed to have human beings on it. Without the trees, humans won't survive.
Wonderful, yeah. So life wouldn't be able to thrive, you know, that the trees basically give us everything that we need. Rachel, did you jump in with a question?
Yeah, so speaking of interconnectedness and how we have this mutually beneficial, like harmonious relationship, I was wondering how sensitive trees are to human activity. Like how quickly do they react to things that humans are doing? And that goes out to anyone.
It'd be now. Yeah. They're just like, if one went like this to a tree, they know it.
Okay.
They know it. And even if you use your own house plant right in front of you and breathe on it, it'll know it, because you got this carbon dioxide around you that you're breathing out, and they enjoy that, and you enjoy that oxygen that they give out to you. But we don't think of those things most of the time because it's always there for us. And they're there for us.
Maybe a question on a similar vein is that I know that we can look at our Earth's climate record by looking at ice core samples from places like Antarctica. And I'm wondering if there's something similar that we can do by looking at some sort of sample from trees and look at the history of our Earth that way.
Yeah,
well, I mean, glaciers. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Cash. If you.
Oh, just saying. Well, you can also check out the glaciers in the same way. Yeah.
I'll just add to that yeah, you can also take core samples from trees as well, and it's pretty amazing to see. Tree rings will look differently depending on the environmental conditions that they were growing in at any given time. So if it's drier year, if they were shaded, like there are certain trees, for example, if they've been growing in the understory for a long time, the tree rings will be really tight together because they haven't been able to grow very fast. So they might look really small, but they could in fact be really old. One more thing, Rachel, I just wanted to come back to, you know, your question about like, how quickly do they respond? And I wanted to add to Koskash's comment that I think that, yeah, we often don't realize how much plants are responding to our actions or even our attitudes. And perhaps some folks, hard scientists might think of that as not, not something that they'd subscribe to, but increasingly there's been a lot of actually scientific work that shows just because trees don't respond the way humans do doesn't mean that they're not responding. So it may not be visible to us, or it may not be visible to us on the time scale that we're familiar with, but they are certainly responding. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Emily, just to add on to what you're talking about there, in hearing your question, I was also thinking about the way that we respond to trees. So a lot of people think only about the impacts that people have on trees, but trees have such an impact on us too. And so I didn't really have words to explain like the way the tree makes me feel, which is like usually very good and relaxed. But the other day I was like reading more about this idea, and it turns out that some researchers in Japan have been trying to explain that feeling, and they found that there's some trees that release chemicals that they called aromatics, and that those aromatics actually have a physiological response in our bodies. So our bodies start to de-stress when we're around these trees, and we can absorb those chemicals from them. And then we start to have a lower blood pressure and a lower heart rate. And this helps actually our immune system functioning. So I just wanted to share that. That's something I recently learned that I thought was really cool.
It's interesting that you said that, Tonya, because I actually live really close to Pacific Spirit Park, and I tend to go there whenever I have exams or, something stressful coming up. So it's nice to hear that there is some sort of science behind what I'm feeling, that it is truly distressing.
Jordan, I wanted to bring you back into the conversation. I know we don't have a video of you, but did you have anything that you wanted to add about the interconnectedness of trees with humans?
What was that? I missed your last part.
Oh, just about anything you wanted to add on the questions that we were talking about, the interconnectedness of trees and humans.
Yes, I could see where that coming from. I have to look at it from two directions, right? Because I come from the First Nations, which really cares about the environment and the trees, right? And then I work in forestry, where that I gotta create economic development for the community so that we could benefit from it in certain ways. And when we remove a tree, right, we go out and do a harvest block. For every tree that we take out, we plant 5 trees to replace that one, right? So we're trying to put 5 trees in so that it'll replace the one tree that we've taken out, so that something has a way to survive, to grow back for the future generations. Because when you look at it, all the trees are used for something, right? You take cedar, for example. Cedar is used for protection for the health workers in the hospitals during this COVID pandemic, right? So that's one of the big things for it, right? Then you take other things that are used for homes and whatnot. So we sure got to make it work for to have it sustaining, and to have it to look after environment, so that we could live with this and have the good pure air that we breathe in, and the nice fresh streams, that water running all the time, where that we could have fish, right? It just it impacts everything. So I think we are the only company that's going above and beyond to try and reintroduce all of this, so that we could have the best of both worlds of the environment and harvesting the trees, right? So it goes through a lot of paperwork before we even cut a tree down. We probably walk the land probably about 100 times before we even get to harvest a tree, because we got to please our nation, and then we got to please get the right trees that is going to be for market, right?
Wonderful, yeah. So we're almost out of time here, but I just wanted to leave with sort of like one thought about sort of like the trees in our planet, and eventually, Rachel and I are going to be continue on sort of this discussion about life in the universe, and at some point, we're going to be pondering the existence of life on another world, and if that other world would need to have trees to have like a really thriving ecosystem? Like perhaps like we find a world that has, you know, maybe one that is not as thriving or maybe as young, but I'll pose a question out to you, a very sort of like big metaphysical question. Like, do you think a thriving ecosystem would need to have something like trees? I mean, maybe it wouldn't look like the trees on our planet, but do you think that something like trees is essential to having life on a planet?
Well, my 2 cents is, I think it's, you know, especially as we're making progress with traveling to other parts of the of space, we forget that there really is only one planet, and the millions of years that it took to create it and make it a livable place. It's virtually irreplaceable. So when we look at trees, I mean, as Koskas was saying, we would not be here. Trees are what made it possible for us to be here. So perhaps in a different world, you know, but certainly the one that we understand, I don't think that it's possible without them.
You know, that's really interesting. We ask a question sometimes in our school programs as a thought experiment when it comes to the moon. What would life be like on our planet if we didn't have the moon? And that just sort of like sends, you know, kids sort of like thinking about all of the different things. And so if we were to ask that question about trees, what would our planet be like if there was no trees? And I think everything that I've heard in the last half an hour is that there would be no life. Is that correct?
Yes.
Everyone's nodding in agreement.
I think it would be, yes. I would think it'd be nothing here, right? It what makes the universe work, right? Without the trees, and then we have nothing.
Wonderful. Well, Koskas, Tonya, Emily, Jordan, thank you so much for joining us here at the H. R. McMillan Space Center. Maybe let's do this again, maybe next equinox, because, you know, our planet goes through cycles, and we'll be cycling back, and I would love to talk more about with trees with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank
you, Rachel.
And everyone out there on YouTube land, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to be back tomorrow night. So if you want to talk about alien worlds, potentially trees on those alien worlds, we're going to be spending a whole hour with Dr. Michelle Kunimoto tomorrow night for our virtual Cosmic Nights. So make sure to get a ticket and get in for our virtual Cosmic Night. It's going to be really fun. Our Cosmic Nights are lively discussions where you get to be part of the conversation. Rachel and Michelle are going to be diving in to alien worlds. And if anyone's been watching Raised by Wolves, I'm getting super jazzed about thinking about Kepler 22b. Don't know what Kepler 22b is? Find out tomorrow night. And make sure to like and subscribe our YouTube channel, because we got lots of fun programs coming up over the next month. Thank you so much. We will see you next time.
Thank you. So that's
okay. We're ended now. There's always a delay on YouTube, so I just got to wait for it. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. That was